Hello, class. As you know, we've been discussing what makes America exceptional and the characteristics that define the American identity. I thought it would be helpful for us to discuss more specifically where this idea of a city upon a hill came from. If America is this bright, shining example to the world, that idea must have come from someplace. You can even see it in this image that I found online when I looked up a city upon a hill. This idea that America is somehow a bright, shining example to the world. So really what we have to do is figure out, where did this idea come from? And as we look into that, I think we can find a lot of evidence in Native America as well as in the European world that conquered it. So let's try to figure out how the connection between the old world and the new one contributed to our understanding of American exceptionalism. The first thing that we need to think about is what was happening in America before Columbus, so before 1492. And if you think about it, world history before America really provides us some really important clues to this idea of where a city upon a hill came from. First, we know that the separation between Native American people and their European and Asian counterparts at the end of the Ice Age was a really key moment. If you think about this map, you can see where Native American peoples during the Ice Age were able to cross the Bering Strait. So in the upper left corner of this map, you can see where they crossed the Bering Strait. But that was actually linked land-wise during the Ice Age because the water level had dropped. So actually you could walk from Asia to North America. Once the Ice Age was over and the water level rose back up again, it cut off those people. So one of the things you have to understand about Native America is that it will develop completely distinctly from Europe, Asia, and Africa. So this half of the world, one half of the planet, the Western Hemisphere, will develop completely independently from the Eastern Hemisphere. So if I lived in Africa, Asia, or Europe after the Ice Age, there were connections between all those people. I can get from Africa to India, or I can get from India to England during that time. Not so for these people in the Western Hemisphere. So all of the people that lived in North and South America are going to develop separately from the people that live in Africa, Europe, and Asia. And that's going to be a really crucial difference. So once those people come here and they're separated, they're going to develop their own distinct cultures. And one of the things that the text points out is that North and South America line up on sort of a north-south axis. So all the people in North and South America are spread out from north to south. Whereas if I lived in Europe, for example, my orientation is east-west. So if you look at a map of Europe, you'd see how all the people are kind of crammed together in that same longitudinal line. So they're going to have the same kinds of plants and animals and diseases, whereas people in North and South America are going to have all different kinds of plants, diseases, different kinds of temperatures, different environments. So you're going to have a lot more diverse societies in North and South America. And they're going to be a lot different from the way the European societies will develop. The second thing that you should note is that these early native peoples were very advanced in both their technology and their social organization. So one of the things that your book is trying to point out to you in chapter 1 is that people that lived in these early native cultures were not savages. They were very, very advanced. And I really want you to remember 4 examples. So your book brings up many different examples, but there are really only 4 that I expect you to remember. So let's talk about these 4 examples. First, if we look at regions of the country, there are really only 2 regions I expect you to know about. One region is going to be Central American region, like southwestern U.S., Central America, and South America. So this circle that I've put on the map here would be this particular region. And if we go back through Native American history, we can see an example of this Mesoamerican culture that we today call the Olmec people. So these Olmecs, which were known for these stone carvings of these giant stone heads that they would make as part of their religious practice, these people developed huge trade networks, huge agricultural cities, like cities based on agriculture, where they would have thousands and thousands of people living in these cities. And some of these Olmec cities, which would have been right around the same time as the ancient Egyptians, had civilization as advanced, or even more so, than some of the civilizations that were in Europe and Africa and Asia. So when you think about the influence, we always look at it from a European perspective, but the truth is that these Native American cultures were incredibly advanced. And as the Olmec died out, they passed down their ideas and beliefs to later generations of Central American peoples. So by the time the Europeans arrive in the 1400s, the Olmecs are long gone, and in their place the Aztec, the Inca, and the Maya to some extent have risen to power. So by the time the Europeans come and they meet the Aztecs and the Inca, they very much have continued on the ideas of the Olmec. And you can see in this picture, this sort of graphic representation of the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, how incredibly large these cities were. I mean, they were enormous cities with huge population centers. Millions of people were involved in these big, huge trade networks that were all based around these farming societies. And one thing that you should remember about the Aztec is how clearly and distinctly they developed agricultural technology to fertilize or to bring water to desert lands in order to farm. So they were incredibly technologically advanced, and we don't think about that because when we think of technology, we think of guns, for example. And so just because they didn't have these weapons that could destroy things, they certainly had technology that allowed them to use their environment and to adapt to their environment without destroying it. So if you think about these two examples, the Olmec, which would have been back during the times before Christ, and then you think about the Aztec, who would have come around in the early 1200s to the 1400s. These are the people that will meet the Europeans. When the Spanish arrive, they will run head on into these people from Central America. The other region that we should remember are the Eastern Woodlands people. And the reason these people are important is because if you look where they settled, where these people lived, they're going to have a great impact on the settlement of these early English colonies that will later become America. So the first to remember in this particular Eastern Woodlands region, again, we can go back into the times around Christ or even before Christ, so into the BC time period, and we see the Hopewell people. We talked about them in the History Quest. These were also known as the Mound Builders, and they built huge cities. This is actually a map, a graphical map of what Cahokia would have looked like. Cahokia was one of their largest cities. It's in the site of current-day St. Louis, along the Mississippi River, and you can see just how enormous these civilizations would have been and how advanced they would have been in terms of the way they lived together, worked together, built huge trade networks and empires, really an advanced civilization. The city of Cahokia was actually larger than any city in Europe or Africa at the time. So when you think about what these Hopewell people were able to accomplish, it's pretty amazing. And we don't think about that in terms of our comparison to them and Europeans. Now, as the Hopewell people died off or spread out, they gave way to what we know as the Eastern Woodlands people. One of the tribes of the Eastern Woodlands, which is going to be very important in our study of U.S. history, is going to be the Iroquois people. The Iroquois people were a group of 5 tribes. And you can see from this graphic representation of the way they lived, they actually lived in these communal little towns where people would work together to basically live and work and trade in these matrilineal societies where it was based on the elders really helping to take care of the people that lived in the village. So these Iroquois people, which were descendants of the Hopewell, we can really see that they're going to have a big impact on these settlers who will come from Europe. So when you think about this overall, the 4 tribes to remember, the Olmec, who eventually gave way to the Aztec, and the Hopewell, who eventually gave way to the Iroquois. These were advanced cultures, advanced societies, and your book is trying to point out that there was a huge diversity and technological advancement among these people that these Europeans are going to meet. So it's important to remember that when you think about what are the Europeans meeting when they come. So if you remember one thing about Native American culture, you should remember that it was really technologically advanced, but it was a society that was based on communal property, about sharing and helping each other, living in a community, respecting elders. It was very different from European society, which was very competitive and really more of a taking culture. So you're talking about a sharing culture, the Native Americans, in comparison to a taking culture, which they'll meet when the Europeans arrive in 1492. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the Old World. If Native America is the New World to these Europeans, what was the Old World like? And chapter 2 of your textbook really starts to go into the Old World and explain to you a little bit more clearly what was happening in Europe. Well, you should understand that European culture was all based around feudalism, which is how people take control of land. So because Europe had a small amount of land, there was a fierce competition for that land. So this European feudal culture developed into a really competitive society that was fueled by mercantilism. Mercantilism is based on the theory that there's a limited amount of wealth in the world, and whoever gets more of that wealth wins. So these Europeans were driven to get as much wealth and land as they could, and basically they had the idea that however they could get it was fine as long as they won in the end. So the fact that the ends justify the means is really what their culture was about. So if you compare this old world European value, which is I want to win at all costs, to a Native American culture that was for thousands of years based on sharing and communal living, you can see where there's going to be a conflict between those two cultures. In addition to that, we also see that the competition between these European people and this quest for wealth really creates many of the things that we know today as Americans. It inspired capitalism. It inspired the creation of states. Like as they competed against each other, they formed nation states. It developed new technologies like ships that could travel further, guns that could kill other people as part of this competition, weapons and tools for navigation. And ultimately, it really fueled all these European states to go and look for new places, to conquer and take over. So when you think about Europe at the time, you can really see these European nation states. You can see how these states of Europe developed. This map is from Europe and right around 1490, so it would have been right before Columbus. And you can see how there are distinct nation states. The ones that we're going to focus on specifically will be Portugal, Spain, France, and England. And you can see all of those countries pretty clearly on this map, and they're all sort of fighting for control of a very small land area. Europe is the smallest geographic continental space on the planet. So as a result of that, there's going to be a fierce competition for land. And that fierce competition for land is going to lead to the creation of new technologies and exploration, and really the power that Europe will have as it dominates the rest of the world. So let's talk specifically about when these two worlds connected. So now we can see that we have this old world, which was Europe, and this new world, which was Native America. And these two worlds have two very different ways of doing things. And what's going to happen when they connect with each other? Well, we can see those connections because Europe's quest for additional resources led them to look outside. We don't see that happening in Native America. They weren't looking for resources. They weren't looking to dominate others. There wasn't a competition in Native America. That's why they're not exploring and going to other parts of the world, whereas Europeans are desperate to win the game and get more in terms of this idea of mercantilism. So they're going to spread outward, and we're going to see 4 examples of that we need to remember. First, Portugal. The Portuguese will be some of the first to sort of explore outward, and it makes sense because if you think about where Portugal is on the map, you can see it there in the upper left-hand corner where it says Lisbon. You can see Portugal there right on the edge of Spain, sticking out into the Atlantic Ocean. So clearly Portugal is going to develop this seafaring capability probably faster than any other European country except maybe England. So as Portugal develops, they actually have a school for navigators. They have a school where navigators can go and learn the craft of navigation. And for Europeans, getting to India, getting to China was a key motivating factor. They could not cross Asia because of the geography and the basic hordes of Mongols and the Genghis Khan and his people were basically blocking any European attempts to cross by land through Asia into India and China. And so because of that, they had to try to find some other way to get to India, where they knew there were valuable trade resources, so they could expand their empire by moving into India and China. But in order to do that, they had to figure out how to get there. So we see people from Portugal, people like Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Dias, who will try to go around Africa. And on this map, you can really see that they didn't really have the capability of a full-on ocean-going trip all the way around Africa. So they're going to consistently stop along the coast of Africa. And you can see where in 1434, in 1455, in 1460, they would make stops around the coast of Africa. And interestingly, as a result of this and this need for Europeans to control whatever resources they could, that's where we're going to start to see Europeans enslaving Africans to use as part of this competition. It's a free labor source, so it gives them an advantage. And that's going to start really here when these Portuguese explorers are exploring the coast of Africa. They're going to start trading for African slaves and taking control of African slaves, which will carry over into this connection with American slavery later on. So it's important to see where that starts. So for the Portuguese, it's really this quest to get to Asia, to get to India and China. And all the other countries in Europe now, because of the competition, they're going to want to do the same thing. So now Spain decides, I've got to do it too. I've got to go out there as a Spanish empire, and I've got to get to India, I've got to get to China to get these resources so I can beat Portugal in this competition. So what does the Spanish empire do? Well, Columbus, who is actually an Italian, goes to the king and queen of Spain and says, I have an idea of how to do this in a way that's better than the Portuguese way. Let's go straight across and go around the world instead. The problem is, Columbus and other Europeans at the time thought the world was about half the size that it actually is. They didn't even think the Western Hemisphere existed. So by sailing away from Spain and sailing in a westerly direction from Spain, instead of going around Africa, going south, if they go west across the Atlantic, they thought they would just circle around the globe and they would come to China. And that was actually Columbus's theory. They would come to China and India, which is where their destination was. So Columbus and then the people who would follow him appealed to the Spanish government by saying, hey, we can expand the Spanish Empire and spread the word of God. Spanish people were very Catholic. Spread the word of God, and in the meantime, get more gold for Spain. So the Spanish approach is very much gathering this gold and spreading the word of God. And once Columbus opens the door and finds this new world that exists, they're going to try to come to that new world and find what resources they can get here. The reason we call Native Americans Indians is because Columbus thought he was in India when he first arrived. So there's some debate about whether Columbus even knew whether or not he had not found India and China, but instead had found a whole new world. So this new world that's opened up by Columbus, people will follow him. And those Spanish explorers who follow Columbus are known as the conquistadors. Now this map I think is really useful because it shows us the Spanish exploration routes and it shows us the Portuguese exploration routes. So you can actually see in this map the red is the areas that were explored by the Spanish. So you've got Columbus, and you can see his voyages there that were down towards the Antilles and Cuba and eventually Central America near Costa Rica. But then you can see all these other red areas on the map that the Spanish explored. And note, that's going to come and put them in direct conflict with those Central American natives that we talked about before, the Aztec and the Inca people. So the Aztec would be right around where Mexico is located, and the Inca people would be down where you can see Peru on the map of South America, on the left-hand side of that map of South America. So obviously these Spanish explorers, their job is going to be to spread the word of God and steal as much gold as they can. Conveniently for them, the only two Native American cultures that had a substantial amount of gold were the Aztec and the Inca. And they're going to basically wipe those people out. One little side note, If you notice that the Portuguese also spread down into, eventually when they figured out that there was a whole new hemisphere here, they actually will also come down and spread into part of South America. And that's why Brazil today, the official language of Brazil is actually Portuguese, where the rest of Central and South America speak Spanish. So that should give you a little insight into why people in Brazil today speak Portuguese instead of Spanish. So the other two countries we have to think about are France and Spain. And the French sort of come later to this idea. Once they know there is a new world, once they know that there is a North and South America, they don't know how big it is. And their quest here is not to sort of use this new place they've found. Their quest is still to get through it, to get by it in order to get to India and China, which was where they knew all these trade goods were. So they're going to be constantly looking for the Northwest Passage. This Northwest Passage is what these European people called the passageway through North and South America. Now, we know by looking at geography that there is no passage. There is no way through North and South America until much, much later when we dig the Panama Canal. But back in those days, there was no way through. So they would be looking for every river to see how far that river would go inland, and hopefully it would dump them out on the other side into the Pacific Ocean. So they're looking for this Northwest Passage. And if you look at these purple lines here, we can see how they explored the coastline, sort of desperately looking for these river passages that they thought would take them through the continent. The most important one to note is up at the top of the map where you can see Cartier and Champlain. They went down the entire St. Lawrence River all the way to the waterfalls at Montreal and then beyond to the Great Lakes. So when they first arrive in the Great Lakes, they think that they've arrived at the Pacific Ocean when in fact that was not the case. So you can see they also explored the Mississippi River. So the reason you're going to have French trading posts not only in what is today Canada, but then also in what was then the Mississippi River Valley, is because of the fact that they were exploring these rivers, desperately trying to find a way through, to try to get through North America to get to the other side. In the meantime, though, they're going to set up these trading posts, predominantly Quebec and Montreal, and they're going to work with the Native Americans because they don't see them as anything other than a resource to trade with. And that's going to be really important for the French because they're going to be more of an adaptive approach instead of a conquering approach. And we're going to talk about that later on. Finally, if you think about the English approach, the English are going to come last to this party. They're going to be the last ones to really come along this exploration route, but they're also going to end up being the most important. And let me explain why that is. If we compare the different reasons for colonization, we can look at each of the four European countries, and we're going to not worry so much about Portugal because they're not going to have that big of an effect on America, but we're going to look at the three countries that will have a big effect on America. We're going to look at Spain, France, and England. So let's take a look at each of these and sort of consider who these people were, why they came, and what happened as a result. So as we know, Spain was the first. After Columbus opens the door, you're going to have all these conquistadors and Catholic missionaries coming to spread the word of God and search for gold. So what happens as a result? Well, first of all, they're going to be successful early on. They are going to find gold. They are going to be able to force these people to convert to Catholicism. And in fact, they're going to build a whole system which becomes known as the encomienda system, which was an economic system of plantations where they would have these Native Americans working on the land for them, and they would provide food, and they would convert them, and all these missions that they would start. We think about these places like San Diego, San Francisco, these sand mission places that were established throughout the Central and South American region, and then later into the west coast of the United States. They would set up these missions where they would try to convert the natives. And eventually you're going to have a mixed breed. You're going to have some Spanish interbreeding with natives. Those people become known as mestizos. So you have almost like a mixed breed of Spanish and native peoples that come as a result of this invasion of the conquistadors. But something happens in 1588 that will change everything. The Spanish Armada is destroyed off the coast of England by a freak storm that happens in 1588. So if you think about it, from 1492 to 1588, the Spanish are going to dominate colonization of the Americas. They're going to be the ones that really control all of the New World. But once that armada is destroyed in 1588, it leaves a huge void for these other European countries to now take a step forward and try to do something. So as I said before, France is going to look for this Northwest Passage. So they're going to send explorers and Jesuit priests over. But remember, they're not here to settle. They're not here to really, cause long-term settlements. They're really just looking for a way through. So the St. Lawrence and Mississippi River valleys are going to be the key to those explorations. And they're just going to set up trading posts for trade with these natives. They're going to trade especially furs from beaver pelts. They're going to trade with these natives. And eventually they'll trade other things like tobacco and fish. But for the most part, you're looking at them trading fur, which was very valuable in Europe. So the French are finding ways to adapt. They're trying to find ways to work with the natives so they can get more wealth from them rather than try to convert them and kill them and destroy them and force them to change. And really, there is no gold in the northern part of North America, so they weren't looking for that. They were just looking for a way through, which they will ultimately never find. So into this void that the Spanish have left, we have some French explorers, but we're really going to have an enormous number of English settlers. And the reason is that these early English settlers, although initially they're looking for wealth, they will eventually be followed by all kinds of other people from England. Because of all the European countries, England has the most people who are seeking religious freedom. There are people who are looking for political freedom and people who are looking for economic freedom. And as a result, you have all these people from England who are looking for a new start, who are looking for a new life. And so not so much in France, not so much in Spain, but in England there's an enormous number of people who want to come. So despite their early colonial failures, like Newfoundland and Popham and Roanoke colonies, those colonies all failed, the English settlers are going to start to learn how to adapt. And that adaptation is going to lead to the development of the 13 colonies. So hopefully this gives you a good overview of the first sort of 3 chapters of the textbook. And as you go through and watch this video or you listen to these points that I've made, it should help you on your online quiz. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.